Hi, witch and pagan folk. I'm going to talk today about my journey to witchcraft. To do that, I have to take you right back to the early years and through some pretty traumatic times, but obviously it has a happy ending. Also a trigger warning for anyone who gets triggered by talking about psychosis, eating issues, mental health issues. Don't watch this video because that comes into it. I wasn't sure whether to make this video, but Drew from She Who Walks Between the Worlds, she made a video about her journey to witchcraft and kind of encouraged me to do that when I commented on it. So here we go, Drew. It might seem unrelated to witchcraft at points, but it does tie up at the end. And go grab a cuppa and come back because it might be a little bit long. So in my early years, I was adopted. A lot of you know that already, and broken away from my roots. Then in my early years, around age 2, I experienced a trauma that was a near death. From this point on, I heard voices and saw things. In the moment of my trauma, spirit saved me and literally told me what to say and do to save my life. I was not always at peace with what I saw. A lot of it terrified me. Shadow beings, things like that. It was actually a crucial and important moment in my journey. Both of those things were. But for years after, literally like 17 years, they just felt hugely traumatic and hard to understand. What was I like as a child? Deep imagination, adored fairy tale and folklore and myth, attraction to graves, to the dead, deep connection with animals. I found I could get very close to frightened animals and be able to soothe and relate to them. In fact, I felt better able to relate to animals than humans, and in some ways I still do. I had a strong connection to the sea. I saw it as a living being. Again, I still do. I was highly empathetic. I felt other people's emotions. I'm an aura feeler. Sometimes I get colours, but not always round the person, more coming into my mind as I feel that aura. That's still true of me today. I am a bit weird because I have a problem with the word empath, or more the way it's used now. I feel like it's often used in quite a snowflakey way, which isn't really empathetic in and of itself. You know, high levels of empathy are often a response to trauma. The other side is losing empathy, which can also happen, which happened to my husband actually. He's got issues being able to empathise because of trauma that he went through. It's a great thing if you use it to help others, but it is a bog standard part of being human, and different people have different levels of it. Obviously it can be harder to manage. I completely understand that when you do have higher levels of it. But I also feel it's been kind of twisted into this highly unique quality, a bit indigo child or star child, where a large number of people actually experience high levels of empathy and feel other people's emotions within themselves. And that's a normal thing for us. We are social animals, you know, that our whole structure and really ourselves, in fact, are built on relationships with other people and other beings. So yeah, highly empathetic, but I'm not gonna, I don't see that as this snowflakey amazing quality, basically. I also had vivid dreams, many of which I can still remember today. I lived in London in my early years. One of my parents was a vicar in the Anglican Church. I don't have an issue with Christianity. I do have an issue with the way that humanity uses it as an excuse to do terrible things. I certainly have a difficulty with any religion really being used in a very fundamental way. And I think that Christians forget, you know, the Bible was written by men. There is no claim that it was written by God. the God that Christians believe in. And I think that definitely gets left by the wayside as well. Because one of my parents was a vicar, I had a lot of exposure to people who were hurting, grieving, deeply sad. I heard a lot about death. I also heard about other issues like homelessness and poverty from a very young age. In London, we lived near to a council estate where there were a lot of issues, a lot of sadness. And I always really wanted to be able to help those people, to make them feel better emotionally as well as physically. I could feel the energy of their emotions, and sometimes I could feel their pain, or I knew something without being told. And even at this very early age, sometimes people would talk to me about their pain or their problems. I was really small and I could often react in a helpful way, but I didn't understand what you have to do to help somebody heal. Then in my primary school years, just after starting primary school, I moved from London to Hertfordshire. I missed London so much. London felt like home. I adored the countryside, but I had this deep connection where it was almost like I could feel London's heart beating. At primary school, I spoke to trees, a sycamore tree, grandmother willow at my school. We called her grandmother willow, that me and my friend called her that. And she used to heal my friend and I's fights. We always went to her if we had a fight, and we would make up by her as well. Also, a weeping cherry tree in my garden I had a really good relationship with. I played at being a witch all the time. I was obsessed with it. I had a really big bauble about this big, and you could put things in it. So I used to put little spells in it and charms and things. And I used to crystal ball gaze with this bauble. It was like a deep midnight blue with little gold stars all over it. I did have some encounters with Romany gypsies where I lived, opening me up to the idea of divination. I had a lot of really good friends in primary school and secondary school actually, but I always felt like an outcast. I didn't feel I fit in. I didn't even feel I was the same as my family. I always had that kind of different feeling, really internalised. And I connected to this folkloric idea of this changeling child. I felt that real strangeness. I wasn't unusual in that, because it is a common thing in adoption. Some people found me odd. I hated my body. I became a tomboy because I felt so uncomfortable at the comparisons between me and the other girls. I didn't want people to be able to compare us, so I dressed in trousers and refused to experiment with makeup. I also started menstruating really early, about 9 or 10. It was excruciatingly embarrassing because I wasn't prepared, and my school wasn't prepared either. And despite hating my body, I could read it really well. I could pick up on anything out of place, but also kind of control or suppress parts of it. I could control some of my physical pain and go elsewhere so as not to deal with it if anything ever happened to me that caused pain. And you'll probably notice in my witchcraft, I have reclaimed some of the things that my experiences made me ashamed of. So I use a lot of menstrual blood, and I do have a focus on female power. This in part is a healing of that time where I felt unable to be womanly and feminine because I just felt I was so lacking compared to everybody else, you know. Now, did I find witchcraft early and start understanding all that had started with my early trauma? Not really at all. I moved house at age 11, a good few hours away from Hertfordshire. I felt completely torn from my friends in my area. The shame I felt being me escalated hugely, and I developed anorexia nervosa with severe depression and anxiety. I blamed myself for childhood trauma, for my adoption, for not being a good enough person, basically. I still believed at my core that if I'd not been such a terrible person, if I'd not been lacking, and I used to describe it as being an ugly baby, that my bare family would have kept me, and that they must have got rid of me because there was something deeply wrong with me. And I love my adoptive family hugely, but knowing or feeling that you weren't good enough, when society talks about a mother's love being the strongest love there is, can be really hurtful and damaging. I did actually find Wicca at about age 12. I was on a forum that gave really good advice, and I learned a lot about basic things: candle magic, energy work, what else? Basic spirit work as well, actually, including never summoning something unless you know what you're doing and you can kind of contain that. I never joined a coven. I never felt drawn to that, but I did spend hours and hours reading and practicing energy work and doing small scale spells. I actually did a ritual with my friend and my sister in my garden, and we asked for our spirit animals to come forward, and for me, Wolf stepped forward. He was actually at that point telling me the roots of my name, and he has to this day a very strong ancestral link for me. This was the beginning of my ancestors trying to get through to me, but I didn't understand at the time. I was probably about 13. So in my early teenage years, I bought the Forest Folklore Tarot, but my parents found it. I told them it wasn't mine. They got rid of it, but I knew I couldn't risk getting another one. So instead, I learned cartomancy with playing cards. I continued to see the sea as a living being. I always felt free and safe and together in the water. I've been able to swim very strongly since I was 2, and going into the sea brought me a really deep peace. Interestingly, I have almost no water at all in my natal chart. Most calculators that add together the different parts of your chart and tell you how much of each element you have come up with no water and no earth. I actually have very small amounts, and if you read into it, I do have some, but really not a lot at all. I'm pretty much all air and fire in my natal chart. So around age 13 or 14, I developed really insane mood swings. I would go from a couple of months being suicidal to a couple of months bursting with creativity, not sleeping, things like that. I later found out this was a bipolar spectrum disorder. For anyone interested in astrology, I also have Moon in first house, so there is a watery link there, you can see. I have Moon square Pluto and Mercury square Uranus and Mercury square Neptune. I know some people are interested in theoretical links between aspects of mental health, including Mercury and bipolar, or more specifically Mercury and mania. So for those people who are, Mercury in my chart has a conjunction, a trine, 2 sextiles, including a sextile to the Moon, and 3 squares, including square Uranus. Then my Mars is also in Gemini, so there is quite a lot going on there. I also have a Jupiter-Pluto square with a Moon square Pluto, then a Sun square Saturn, which along with the Moon square Pluto can be aspects that some people relate to depressive tendencies as well. So if you were looking for that sort of thing in my chart, it does appear to be there. Alongside Cancer in 12th house, which some people relate to family secrets and ancestral trauma. So across my teenage years, I had really serious drug and alcohol problems. I was also sexually abused by somebody outside of the family. My parents weren't fully aware of what was going on either. It was a very closed time for me, I think. I began working with the Virgin Mary around this time, and she continues to be an important figure in my witchcraft now, although I'm not Christian. I suffered with episodes of mania and psychotic symptoms, hearing, seeing, smelling things others couldn't. I suffered with dissociation and depersonalization, where I didn't feel real. I didn't feel like I was in my body, or still even there, I didn't feel connected to the world at all. At one point, I hadn't slept for days and days, and I walked into the sea as one of the things I was seeing was telling me that I could sleep there. My friends were essentially covering up for me and looking after me at this time, so after walking into the sea, I was taken to hospital in an ambulance. I was with my friends at the time, and they offered to my parents, who came to the hospital, to put me in the paediatric psychiatric ward, but my parents didn't want that. I also felt a very strong calling from spirit to heal people, and I made a promise around the age of 15 or 16 that one day I would do that. I still felt everybody's emotions and energies really strongly, but I wasn't managing it at all. I wasn't even managing my own energies and emotions. I found I could help people short term and realign energies for a little while at those times, but I still didn't understand the processes of long-term healing. People would often come and talk to me about their problems, and I always tried to help, or at least spend some time with them. Even on day trips out, if I was on the train, someone would sit next to me and tell me things that were bothering them, and I found it was a very honouring experience to have that. I think that that people felt able to approach me and share those parts of their lives or feelings with me. I wasn't really sure what I could do, but offered to keep me in my thoughts, or if they needed it, do something a bit more practical, like give them details of a local shelter or charity, or buy them food. I used to carry around details of those things in my handbag in case, as well as a mini first aid kit. Later in my teenage years and early adulthood, I also volunteered with St John's Ambulance. So I had several friends at school who self-harmed. I self-harmed myself, and I learnt to dress and steri-strip wounds, which I used to do for my friends, and they used to come to me if they had self-harmed at school. I also began to learn techniques for ADHD, as a friend of mine wasn't really helped out by our school, and I was trying to support him. I tried to do energy work to help too, but it never lasted long enough to do much, bar when he was actually with me. I worked at a shop in my gap year, and people would come to tell me things about themselves then as well. I remember a lady with bulimia broke down at my till talking about it, and all I wanted to do was help. But I was still internalising all my own pain, and I wasn't using it properly yet. I knew I wanted to do more, but when you look back, it was really my own issues, being this chaos in me, really, that stopped me progressing. So around age 16, I stopped using drugs for a while. I had an out-of-body experience around this time for the first time. It was spontaneous, and at the time really scary, but really fascinating. I was lying in my bed, and suddenly my spirit flew up, and I was above my body looking down, but I was kind of panicking because I didn't know how to get back in. It was a very bizarre experience as a first time. Although if you compare it to other people's first time experiences, it's a very normal one. So I had positive experiences with spirits. I still felt terrified by some of the things I saw. I remember like a huge gaping mouth above the sea with things flying into it, and this high-pitched screaming, and that really frightened me. I grew a little more confident in spell work, and I started to work more with the energies of the woods and the sea. I didn't feel able to cope with the aftermath of my trauma. My mood swings and the things I was seeing and hearing were very difficult to deal with. So I started using drugs again. I used opiates and MCAT or methadone, meow meow, that one. It was before it kind of hit the headlines. It was very easy to get hold of because at that time it was legal. and my dealer used to use me as a test subject. Basically, he would give me certain things to test, and I would report back to him on what the effects were and things like that. So that was between the age of about 17 to 19, and I was still drinking at that point as well, really heavily. So I was trying to control all those experiences in completely the wrong way. I spent a huge amount of time out with friends or staying at their houses. A couple of my friends were casual drug users, but there was no peer pressure. My friends were more keen for me to give up drugs completely than to, than trying to pressurize me into taking them. It was much more, they were very concerned about my well-being. And as my drug and alcohol problems escalated and I got older, I stayed with friends so often that I was pretty much living in between their houses. I would go to school or sixth form, go to ballet class or an after-school rehearsal, or go out with my friends, and then I would go to a friend's to stay. I only really went home to pick up or sleep. That was it, really. Often I'd just sleep, usually I would sleep at my friends' houses, but occasionally I would have a day where I just went back home to sleep, because I don't sleep that well around other people. I don't sleep that well anyway. But so my friends are epically amazing about all my issues. I am truly blessed and lucky to have had the friends I've had. Other people at school definitely thought I was off my rocker, which I was, really. But my friends were the reason I got through it. And the other person who had a huge influence on me and saved me more than once was my counsellor. I had a lot of bad counsellors and psychologists. I had a really unhelpful input from eating disorder services who didn't realise I was tricking the scales or take my issues seriously at all. No one seemed to connect any of it to adoption trauma or realise there'd been trauma in my early years. No one seemed to be able to pick up on my mood swings. I have no idea to this day how my school did not realise that I was using opiates. There are photographs of me in sixth form, at sixth form, and it's so obvious. But anyway, other story. So anyway, I walked out of those services and I refused to go back. And then at the end of being 14, this is when I was using stimulants regularly, my friends were so concerned about my drug use that they said if I didn't go to counselling, they would tell my parents. And so I went to counselling. It was through a charity at that time, but my counsellor changed to being private. And originally my parents didn't know, but after a while I told them. And I met a really fantastic counsellor. She was so patient with me, and she restored this tiny seed of hope that maybe I wasn't this horrific human being. Now that seed didn't grow until much, much later, but she planted it. She was a pagan, and we spoke at length about these beliefs and about me seeing things and reincarnation and death and the out-of-body experience that I had. And she gave me some really valuable guidance. A lot of my information at that point still came from Wicca and cobbled together bits of folklore, but I was adjusting it to suit me because the strict ceremonial approach just wasn't something that I'm that comfortable with. So I spent time talking to nature spirits and connecting with animals and feeling the power in the water and the wind. I would count this time as the beginning of truly being a witch, but I was not yet in control of myself enough to be a good one. So my counsellor helped me stop using drugs around age 16. And then again, just before the summer, I went to uni about age 19. So in my later years, after my gap year and working the shop, I went to university. And I returned to live in London and went to a university there. So it was there that I had a full psychotic break that lasted months. I experienced it fully without medication for a good few months before I was sectioned and put inpatient, which also lasted a few months. When I came out, I ended up going straight back in for another few months. I was misdiagnosed as borderline personality disorder, which is also known as emotionally unstable personality disorder. It was a label that the doctor was whacking on everyone, really. She was particularly fond of that label, the inpatient doctor. And I was white, I was female, I was vaguely middle class, and so I fit that supposed bill. There is actually an argument now that EUPD, also known as BPD, does not actually exist, and it's more likely an expression of complex PTSD, but that's a whole other conversation, really. So people think that hospitals provide therapy. A lot of people seem to think that I've spoken to, and they don't at all. The experience of hospital is literally a couple of groups to pass the time. So not therapy groups, not to progress psychologically, just to pass the time. And medication, and that's it. That's what hospital is. They observe you and they give you medication. There are reasons for the lack of therapy, but again, that's another entire kind of debate and conversation in itself, so I won't go into that now. But after that stay, I was, after my first stay, so by my second stay, I was under outpatient care and re-diagnosed as schizoaffective disorder, or something similar, so definitely a bipolar spectrum disorder with psychotic breaks. We now know that in psychiatric terms, it may be both a bipolar spectrum disorder and a coexisting post-traumatic stress disorder. So spiritually, people might view it differently, but however it's viewed, it was a really scary time, and I felt completely out of control and terrified. Or I felt utterly wonderful, but still out of control when my mania was euphoric. So it's worth noting in this that my doctors have never found me easy to diagnose. There wasn't a pattern of symptoms, but the expression of trauma and bipolar spectrum mood swings that fit. There were not clear indications of schizophrenia. Despite full psychosis, it did not fit a typical expression of bipolar spectrum psychosis either. I couldn't distinguish between real and unreal during these episodes. The things I was seeing and hearing and experiencing seemed just as real to me, sometimes more real, than the people who were physically present. My psychosis did have a strong spiritual link and much more pagan than Christianity. I wasn't raving about God or gods. I was talking about the Fae and angels and demons, and other worlds, and I could see these beings, I could smell them, I could hear them and feel them. And at one point I kept hearing voices telling me I had blue blood, and it wasn't until years later that I realised they were trying to wake me up to the power I had in myself to take control of it and kind of reintegrate the parts of myself that needed it, and remind me that I had the ability to soothe, but I wasn't using it properly. So I went in and out of hospital for a few years, and I was put on strong psychiatric medication. I did actually complete my uni. I completed it very slightly late because I had to do some modules that I missed. But I did complete my university. I'm still on medication now, but I refused point blank to go on what they wanted to use because it sapped my creativity, and it took away a part of me as well. Medications like lithium, olanzapine, risperidone, they just didn't work for me. They were horrible, and I know I needed hospitalising for my own safety because I wasn't managing it. I was following what voices told me to do. I believed I could fly and was trying to jump off balconies, out of windows, things like that. But I do feel that these strong meds were really unhelpful for me and that they slowed down my progress in the craft. I thought taking them as an inpatient, and I took myself off them each time I came out of hospital and went on less, I don't even know how you would describe them. I guess like a less strong med, a medication that I felt was less damaging, I went on instead. So I also met a friend in hospital. She is my best friend and she's become like a sister to me. My son calls her auntie, and she supported me so much. She's been with me through a lot. She helped me form a really positive relationship that was so honest and trustworthy, And without it, I probably wouldn't have moved forward in the way I have. So I guess sometimes what seems to be a wrong turning on our path can actually hold something that's really, really positive for us. She is aware of my beliefs and practices, and she can tell if I'm seeming out of control or if I'm just having a normal chat with spirits, or saying, oh, I'm having a chat with my ancestors or whatever, but she knows the difference, between whether I need a little bit of input or whether I'm totally fine. And that's really important, I think, to have someone like that. Something else which really fascinates me and my psychiatrist is that my energy couldn't be contained. So to look at me, you'd think low doses would sedate me, but nothing, no medication seemed to manage to do that. So after this uncontainable energy, I would fall really deep into an exhausted depression. And I do wonder sometimes if this has a link to my neurological problems now, because some aren't really explainable through chronic regional pain syndrome. And perhaps there's a link to that out of control energy. In between the full episodes of Psychosis, which lasted months at a time, I was working on my witchcraft, and in the hospital I met someone who was brilliant at crystal elixirs. I would read cards for people in hospital, but I was very cautious about it, because obviously if people had religious views, particularly people who are experiencing a psychosis that was more towards God or more towards Christian theology, that would be scary for them. So I didn't read it around those people. I began to control things better, though my moods were still swinging. I began to get better at protection and not allowing everything to be felt or seen and heard by me. And I started to learn about astrology, which I don't know lots about it, but I learned enough that it helped me understand myself better. I had some powerful experiences in this time, including a spontaneous out-of-body experience on the moors. I got better at spirit work and how I looked in this physical world to other people, and I knew when to talk to things I saw and when not to. I understood what to allow in or around and what to shut out. I learned to try and calm myself more and to accept it, and when I did, the communications became clearer and calmer too. But I had a lot more to learn on that scale, and so I was still leaving myself open by not fully healing parts of myself. Things got more stable after a while, after I got married, and after a year of being married, I got pregnant with my son using a fertility spell. During my pregnancy, I journeyed to meet my son, and that was really powerful and gave me a really strong bond with him before he was born. I chose his name because of the energy I felt from him in those sessions. We had a pretty traumatic time towards the end of the pregnancy, including the hospitals suddenly telling me a few days before I gave birth that because of the medication I was on, which they had known about from the beginning, they would put my son straight into intensive care for several weeks, and I would have limited ability to care for him because the nurses would be doing the majority. Now, that isn't recommended practice. All babies are supposed to remain with their mother unless and until they show symptoms of issues from a mother's medication. So they told me I would get an hour with him. I said absolutely not, and they threatened me, basically. They told me that at the birth, if I refused the intensive care, then, and this is before this is intensive care in case something happens. Not, of course, I would never refuse intensive care if he needed it, but he didn't need it. It was like a over-the-top precaution. So they told me they would call the police, basically, if I refused to hand him over. And finally, the neonatal matron told us that we could swap hospitals instead. Why that wasn't mentioned at the beginning, I don't know. But that's what I had to do literally a few days before I gave birth. That all made it much more definite for me that I wanted the birth to be as peaceful as possible for him. I used herbalism and hypnobirthing. and we had incense, and I was communicating with the sea and playing a recording of ocean waves and things like that. And I worked a lot with Rose for birthing, and the last stage was so quick that I had an unplanned home birth. So then, after all that kind of stuff, my son was very ill as a baby. It wasn't related to my medication. It's a condition which some boys are born with that affects the kidneys and the bladder. It shows up as constant sepsis infections. So again, I used witchcraft to aid him and protect his body as much as I could. He was only sleeping 20 minutes at a time. My husband and I used to have to take shifts. So I would do 4 nights and he would do 3 nights, because you literally couldn't sleep on the nights that you had him. It took a year for the doctors to diagnose him. But I'll always be glad that I used the witchcraft, because medically speaking, he should have gone into kidney failure and died, and the doctors can't explain why that didn't happen. Now, I feel that the things following that happened partly because I didn't learn from my previous experiences properly. I didn't come to that full understanding through my previous experiences. So, some other distressing events occurred over the time of my son's illness, including difficulties with my husband. He's now diagnosed as having like trauma-related mental health problems that come out as kind of narcissistic end tendencies, including that lack of ability to empathise, and that is much better now. But it culminated when I went into a coma, and when I woke, I had further understanding of things, but it didn't sink in until later. I developed chronic regional pain syndrome at this point, which I still have, and my anorexia escalated and became really severe. I couldn't walk, my brain matter had deteriorated, I couldn't hold conversation, I didn't know what I was saying, I couldn't hold up my head, and services were really, really slow to help. So despite my outpatient psychiatrist pushing for it, they didn't feel that I fit the straightforward expression of anorexia because I was hearing and seeing things. When they finally did help and wanted to put me inpatient, I didn't want to be away from my son, and I knew I had to act and pull myself out of it. At that point, I put things in place to make sure things were as stable for him as possible, but I really knew in my heart that I was letting him down. I needed to get things stable. I needed to get well. I started to journey regularly, and I began to see things in an even wider way. I saw webs of energy and the way people were connected, among other things. I was taught power songs by some of the plants I worked with. But my real healing began when a hypoglycemic attack nearly killed me, and I realised just how much I wanted to live in that moment. I didn't overcome anything that day fully, but something really interesting happened during that attack, which is that the spirits went silent, utterly silent. I couldn't hear them, I couldn't see them, and I was calling to them because I knew I was dying and I needed them, and they would not come. And the paramedics told me I was having a panic attack. Now, I've had a lot of panic attacks in my life, and that was not a panic attack. And I kept saying it's not a panic attack. You know, I'm genuinely unwell. But the paramedic told me to go back to bed. And he never took my blood sugar or did my he did nothing, basically. As I sat on the bed, one of the spirits returned and literally screamed at me to eat something. The spirit was saying to me that it had to be an immediate thing that I needed to eat in that second, basically. And that message saved my life. The following day, I ended up in A&E, and when they took my blood sugar, it was 1.2. So anything under 3 can be fatal. And they told me that the day before, I had been going into a hypoglycemic coma. And the spirit had been telling me to eat honey because I couldn't swallow properly. And I had told my husband that, and he kind of put honey in my mouth. But if he hadn't, I would have died. I was in and out of A&E on a daily basis over that period of time, and I realised that either I conquered my eating disorder once and for all, or I died. But when I appealed to help, for help from services, nothing really happened, and I just essentially thought, you know what, screw it, I've got to do this. I've just got to do this myself. I've just got to do it. And I ended up working with the spirit of Mandrake to pull me out of it. And I asked Mandrake to silence a very bothersome voice. And that voice had been with me since the trauma in my early years. So one night just after that, I was literally thrown from my body. I had a vivid vision where I saved a screaming baby, and I picked it up from this cabin, and I ran because I knew I had to get it, and I couldn't see its face as I'd run in, picked it up and put it against me, and I couldn't see its face because it was wrapped in blankets and then pressed against my shoulder. And when I got to a place of safety and opened the blankets, it was me as a baby in that vision. And from that point on, when I came back from that vision, I felt a lot more together, and the voice stopped being an issue. I guess it was like retrieving a part of myself that had been shut off when I was first adopted, and then shut off further in another trauma at age 2. So I'm not indicating here that I was broken. But I finally stopped fighting my illnesses, and instead of seeing them as this enemy, I began to retrieve that part of myself and listen to it and sought to make it better, instead of just silencing it with drugs and alcohol and other things. And my experiences came together to form a tapestry that I could make sense of. The spirit started to guide me on the path I was supposed to take. But most importantly, I accepted that calling to the craft and that engagement with spirits and my desire to heal properly, and I responded to it with all of my being. Another interesting thing about that was after that dream, a wound on my foot, which would not heal, finally stopped being infected and began to get better. Once I had enough energy to walk again a little bit, I cast a spell to heal my eating disorder. It was quite a complex thing, but yeah, I won't share about it basically, but that's what I did with my ancestors. Now, I've always been a writer, but I'd really struggled since being put on strong psychiatric medication. It was like I couldn't access the words in the same way. I appealed to spirits for aid, and Magpie came to guide me, not only in my creative writing, but in finding my voice and realising my own voice is valid. Telling my own story is valid. I don't need to be afraid of speaking out, and I should not let other people weave a narration around me that isn't true. Magpie began to teach me that people will always dislike you. They won't understand you. They won't listen to you. You won't always feel the same as people, and they won't always get what you do, but that's okay. You still have to speak out. You have to not give up, and you have to trust the power of your voice. And often when I'm struggling to voice something or to speak out for somebody else, a magpie will land nearby me. I discovered traditional witchcraft just before this, and I was surprised to find it was exactly what I was doing already. Since then, I've grown more and more in my craft, and I realised that my physical vessel is worth a lot more than I ever gave it credit for. Through all these experiences, I realised I had to heal me. You know, you can heal others without being well yourself, but it will never be as powerful as if you are well. And if you're dying from anorexia or using alcohol to silence all your pain, then you just can't do it. You're not capable enough. I'm still on my journey, and I'm still learning, and I always will be, really. But now I can recognise the parts of me that need healing and work on them. I've integrated these aspects of my experience and self to work cohesively. And I do take medication, but I refuse the medications that I feel take away from who I am. And I still hear spirits. And I'm fine with that now. And if I'm not the size I want, it doesn't matter anymore, because what really matters is being able to love other people, to care for my son, to connect with my ancestors, to interact and live and experience the world and all of its emotions. And I've certainly felt a lot of those. And, you know, if I'm dying of starvation, I can't pick my son up and twirl him around. I can't hold my husband tight or express myself even. I can't go out and connect with nature, because when you're dying like that, it's really bloody cold. It's the kind of cold that means you can't breathe or think, and it lowers your already low blood sugar, and it shuts down your body and mind. And those who have suffered eating disorders often have issues with the cold after. And part of that is anxiety, because you remember just how terrible it was. Your body remembers. To be that cold is to risk death. But I can manage my energy much better now, and the mood swings, you know, between so much energy, I feel like I can do anything, and so little that nothing is possible. They're more tempered. I do energy exercises. I spend time in nature. I listen to the cues in my body. I could hear them before, but I used to ignore them. I learned that laughter is a wonderful medicine. I learned that expression through arts is really important for me. And I learned to trust myself. I can still drink alcohol because I'm no longer drinking to silence my trauma. I do have periods of time when I don't drink at all. But I also only ever really drink low alcohol drinks, and I don't drink often. I don't use drugs. And I do use psychoactive plants occasionally, but I approach them as teachers, as I approach all plants. When you truly believe that the trauma you suffered is your fault, you can't respect your body or your mind. And it took a lot of people standing with me and pulling me out of a lot of holes before I finally realised that I wasn't an innately terrible person. And that was such a release. And I had to realise that my responses were normal responses to severe trauma, and accept my mistakes and my failings, and accept that I had some good in me as well. And I'm both exactly the same person and entirely different to the person I was before. And it's partly why I'm so against people in the spiritual community talking about people deserving trauma for karmic reasons and staying away from them so as not to damage your own karma. I have very little time for those people, because the way I see it, you do much more damage to yourself through those views than giving someone a bit of your time, you know? And it can also be very upsetting for those who've been through trauma. And I don't look kindly on that at all. But I have an older video that covers that. So working with plants in both medical herbalism and witchcraft has taught me a lot. And for a start, you know, you can't grow without nourishment. A plant doesn't worry about taking in its nutrients. It nourishes itself and uses that energy and blooms. They taught me I can go to them for help when I'm broken, and that I need consistent and strong boundaries. They taught me ways to heal that I'd never considered before. I realised that a lot of my issues came from feeling broken from all my ancestors, and kind of both my adoptive ones and my birth ones. And that broke my connection with the world, with the physical world. And I've worked really hard at re-establishing a connection to both birth and adoptive, and, you know, ancestors of spirit and ancestors of craft. And I've learnt when I honour myself, I honour them. I include my son and my husband in some ways in my connecting to my ancestors, and we do, you know, light candles and have meals and light incense for them and talk to them and include them. And that's why it's such an important, huge part of my witchcraft and on this channel, because I know how important it is to nurture that connection. I used what I learnt to try and guide my husband a bit. We wanted the relationship to work, and because of the narcissistic expression of his trauma, it was very difficult for a long time, but he has now gone to therapy and he recognises his own difficulties, and that made a huge difference to our family. And I made very strong boundaries with that as well. I had to ask my ancestors and guides for a lot of help regarding that. Obviously life is a journey and both of us are still improving, and you know, someone with a lot of issues, like the experiences that I've had, you know, I wasn't a calm and laid back person to live with, let's put it that way. Through working with my ancestors, they've explained why I went through all those experiences, and they've explained the ties that were broken and the rebirthing that happened, and they've aided me in this huge life lesson to reach my full potential. You know, to give back to the world, I have to heal myself. And that's just the first part, because the point of me knowing these things isn't to heal, just to heal me, you know. That's just the first step before I can help others in an even better way. Now, for complicated reasons that don't make a lot of sense, I'm not allowed therapy through the mental health services here. And it's not because I'm not recovered or anything like that. It's more to do with funding and legalities. But when I was told I wasn't allowed it, I was really upset. And legally, you're supposed to be allowed therapy with a counsellor specialising in adoption as an adopted adult. But in reality, it doesn't work that way. So I went to the sea and I did a really lovely ritual there with my ancestors. And they came to me and they said, "You do the therapy, we'll be with you." And it sounds bonkers that I'm giving myself therapy. It certainly wouldn't be recommended by anyone in the therapeutic world. But I came a really long way to get here, and I was left with very little choice. You know, I don't have the money to go private. I'm also not, in my view, unaided, because my ancestors guide me in it. So I guess much like spirit-led ritual, you could call it spirit-led therapy. Our ancestors are so wonderful at showing us patterns because they've been there and done it, and they know the patterns in the family, and that's been really helpful. For example, I realised that the trauma in my birth family was actually mimicked in my adoptive family, and they helped me work out the tangle of thoughts and experiences, and I've done a lot of shadow work. I do want to stress here that it can be really dangerous to do that kind of thing if it's not done properly. And I don't encourage anyone to follow that path if they're dealing with traumatic issues. The way I view it is that the seeds for my work now on myself were sown by my counsellor, who happened to be pagan, and that her guidance, along with spirit guidance and a lot of psychological study and understanding on my part, have made me able to work on these things now. I also have safe people, if you like, who, if I'm feeling like I've gone quite deep and I just need someone to talk to, or you know, someone to be with, my friend who I met in hospital actually is one of those people who I can go to. So yeah, I'm certainly not alone in it. And I know my therapy with myself will never end, because I'll always have something to explore about myself and to improve. And that's kind of like the learning in the craft as well. You know, it goes alongside with that. I'll always have more to learn in the craft. I'll always be progressing, and my story will always be going on until it stops, you know. The plants have really helped me in healing too, like chamomile, who aided me so much with anxiety and flashbacks. I make yearly trips to the sea where I ask the sea for her healing, and she's honoured as our oldest ancestor in my house. She helped me cleanse some of the negativity of the past away, so I still remember everything, but she just took away some of the pain. Over my lifetime, I've done quite a lot of healing ceremonies for other people, but none have been as powerful as they are now. Because of that reintegration, I think, and the healing of those parts of myself. Sorry, there's a cat down here. So my journey to witchcraft was pretty chaotic, to put it mildly, but in many ways I couldn't have grown in the ways I have without that journey, and I felt I was a witch from very young, and I connected deeply with that word. But the journey to where I am with it now was long and gradual, really. I know now, as a witch and as a human, that life can be really rubbish, but it can also be really beautiful, and I have a strength. Ellie! I have a strength that I didn't have before. And I know where I'm going. And part of that will be addressed in a video that's coming up, actually. But at the end of this really long video, so I'm sorry it's so long, I want to thank 2 members of the YouTube pagan community whose videos have really helped me in really difficult times. So Joey Morris and Kellyanne Maddox. I know I've told you already, Kellyanne, but the videos that you have both made have saved me from ending it when I felt utterly hopeless. And just in case either of you watch this video at some point, thank you both so much. Just, yeah, from the bottom of my heart, for sharing your stories and advice and giving so much hope as well that things could get better. And even though they were only recorded videos and we've never truly spoken, you know, they honestly meant so much to me. So I hope that this video has been interesting, I suppose, maybe helpful to some people. It has been a difficult one to share because it was a very long and traumatic journey for me, really, but I would love to hear all of your stories about how you came to witchcraft and where you are in the craft today. So feel free to let me know if you have made a video about it in the comments below, because I'd really love to listen. Much love and many blessings, witches.